Welcome, foolish mortal, to the Average Viewer channel. I'm your host, your vamp host. Kindly grab a snack and take a seat. There's no turning back now. This is about the best show on television that you aren't watching. Let me take you through a journey as I discuss why you should be watching Interview with a Vampire and an in-depth analysis on my newest obsession. This first part of the video will be for those of you who haven't watched the show. Let me give you a pitch, giving you a spoiler-free discussion talking only about the plot within the first episode. After that, I'll be breaking down characters, themes, and the story as a whole, but the longer you stay into the video, the more spoilers will reveal themselves. You have been warned. My first introduction to vampires was back in the 2008 Twilight craze. Elementary school me was a die-hard Team Edward fan, which was really rough on me because all my friends were Team Jacob. They always had to come to me and tell me that Robert Pattinson actually got his abs painted on. I was in the trenches. But Interview with a Vampire feels like the complete antithesis of Twilight in every possible delicious way. For one, it's way more mature than a lot of vampire media that exist, and as an adult with a fully formed frontal lobe, that is something I really come to appreciate. This is my favorite portrayal of vampires that I've ever seen, and a big part of that is because it feels authentic. Not realistic in a literal sense, but emotionally and psychologically real. The show understands that a creature that's been alive for 100, 200, even 500 years would not be celibate, naive, or emotionally frozen in time, because underneath the vampirism, they're still at least a little human. They're flawed, they make mistakes, they hurt each other, but they also continue to grow. And that's what makes this show feel so grounded. There's power imbalance, insecurities, trauma, and unresolved issues, and they bring all of that baggage directly into the relationships they have throughout the show, which is messy, painful, and often very accurate. Vampirism itself is also inherently sexual. Drinking someone's blood from their neck is intimate.
Really, it's the biting it's just so hot.
Vampires have also been used as an allegory through a lot of history for AIDS, addiction, sexual repression, or a fear of other. The genre has never been subtle about this, and the same themes are present throughout the show. So when nearly every relationship in the world is toxic, I'm not surprised. These characters are ancient, powerful, and fundamentally not human. On top of all that, they're just cool. Like, genuinely some of the coolest characters I've ever seen. I mean, look at Louis with his sunglasses. Like, be so fucking for real. How can anyone look that cool? Now, for a bit of background, you've probably heard of Interview with the Vampire before, and that's because it started as a book series by Anne Rice. The novel first came out in 1976, and was later adapted to a film in 1994. And before anyone gets mad at me, I hate remakes just as much as the next person. Like, honestly, I hate them. However, this adaptation makes huge changes compared to both the book and the original film, and those changes don't exist for nothing. They fundamentally reshape the characters and story around these changes, and they actually matter. So please believe me when I say that the remake, for once, is worth it. Now yes, the 1994 movie starring Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise was very hot. I assume. I haven't actually watched it, but, just look at them. I mean, yeah, they're vampires, and it's Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise. What do you expect? That being said, we're not exactly lacking in eye candy here. The series stars Sam Reed as Lestat de Liancourt and Jacob Anderson as Louis de Pointe-du-Lac, and they are generally perfect for these roles. Some people in the fandom have gone as far to say that Sam Reed isn't playing Lestat, but rather Lestat is simply pretending to be a human. The other main character we see throughout the first episode is Daniel Malloy, played by Eric Baganzia. But since this section is spoiler-free, I'm not going to be discussing any of the other characters besides Lestat, Louis, and Daniel that come later, but just so you're aware, there's a couple key players that are phenomenal in their roles as well, that you'll have to see on your own if you haven't seen it. I also want to make it clear that this discussion will be solely focused on Interview with the Vampire, the AMC show, and will not be talking about any other adaptations. I read parts of the books, but for the purpose of the video, all commentary will come from what we're given in the show, unless I've specifically stated outside sources. I understand that there's a lot of material when it comes to the books. I think there's 13 of them, but the show doesn't exactly follow the books, kind of at all, especially when it comes to the characterization, so I'm going to be saying that those aren't exactly accurate to the show, so we're only going to be focusing on what we can see in the show. I would love to see your perspective on anything I discussed in the video or anything I missed. Any corrections or links to sources will be dropped in the description below. Now that you have a bit of background, I'm going to be going through the first episode in detail while keeping the rest of the season spoiler-free. We start the series off with Daniel Malloy. He's a journalist in his 70s with Parkinson's disease. He's isolated, tired, and deeply miserable. One day he receives a package in the mail. cassette tapes from an interview he conducted in 1973. The tapes were sent by a man he interviewed, Louis de Pointe du Lac. Daniel plays the first tape. We hear his younger voice asking what it's like to be a vampire, and we hear Louis calmly answer. Along with the tapes is a letter. Louis invites Daniel to redo the interview in 2022 to revisit the project. The invitation is how Daniel ends up flying to Dubai to meet a vampire again 49 years later. The goal is the same as it was in the first interview. Daniel is meant to document Louis' life story and turn it into a book. Daniel is old, grumpy, and armed with the driest sense of humor imaginable. As Louis' story becomes more unhinged, Daniel becomes the audience's surrogate, the one who says, "That's insane," directly to Louis' face. And he never disappoints. Louis is very rich. He lives in a massive, ultra-modern apartment, cold, stark, all glass and sharp edges. Think Kim Kardashian's house, but it looks more like a mausoleum, which I guess is, in this instance, might make sense. Louis' windows are tinted to block out sunlight, which would kill him. Early on in the episode, Daniel asks Louis where his coffin is, because he saw it during the first interview, and Louis says the apartment is his coffin. In hindsight, that matters. Louis feels trapped, emotionally stagnant, and this interview feels less like a memoir and more like a quiet death wish. Publishing proof that vampires exist would not go over well in vampire society. Daniel brings up how their first interview ended with Louis biting him. Kinky. And Louis casually demonstrates his super speed. Speed, strength, and immortality. This is just the beginning. Daniel admits he doesn't remember much of the first interview. Louis calls this second interview Truth and Reconciliation, and he's not wrong. We start by hearing Louis' story. He's taking us back to 1910 New Orleans, where he's 33 years old and owns brothels in Storyville, giving him wealth and status, but he's also a black man living in the Jim Crow South. Where does that sound familiar? That reality shapes his every interaction. On top of that, Louis is gay. The white men he works with tolerate him, exploit him, and look for ways to undermine him. Louis goes to visit a prostitute that he is fond of named Lily, but he unexpectedly meets Lestat de Liancourt. Lestat is wealthy, charismatic, and a vampire, but Louis is unaware of that fact. During a poker game that Louis and Lestat are a part of, along with the other white men that Louis often works besides, Lestat speaks directly into Louis' mind, points out that the others are cheating, and then stops to rig the hand in Louis' favor. Like, actually stops time, we see it. Telepathy wasn't enough, he just had to flex. Louis is instantly hooked, and so am I. Lestat and Louis end up sleeping together, but soon after, Louis' brother, who struggled with mental illness for many years, jumps off a roof and dies right in front of Louis. He spirals, he avoids Lestat, he tries to see Lily, and then discovers she's been killed by Lestat. Louis goes to a church and screams every sin he can think of in the confession booth. That's when Lestat appears. He kills 2 priests and offers Louis immortality. He offers him a life where he can exist as his true self. Lestat tells Louis that he loves him, and Louis says it's the first time he's ever felt seen. Lestat doesn't turn him without consent, but Louis is at his lowest, and that consent is complicated at best. Lestat turns Louis into a vampire by draining him of his blood and replacing it with his own, and that's where Louis' new life begins. This is really just the beginning of the show. It's intense, it has twists and turns, and the characters are beyond compelling. These 3 in all their glory are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to astonishing acting, dimensional characters, and motivations. And this story really breathes life into the TV of today. It's a deep, emotional roller coaster, and I don't ever plan on getting off. I want to make it clear right now that Interview with the Vampire doesn't ask you to forgive its monsters. It knows they're monsters. It dares you to understand them. Plus, the 3rd season comes out this summer, so now is the perfect time to binge the show and be hyped for its return coming very soon. This section is going to have some spoilers, but it's mostly lore about how vampires work in this universe. For one, vampires, how they die, and their weaknesses. Fire is a big one here. A vampire can be burned and will never be able to come back from it, and the sun does burn vampires. But there seems to be a fine line here, because if you're totally burned to ash, you stay dead, but you can also recover from burns if you're not totally gone. Not sure where the limit is here, but looking into it a bit, it seems like if you keep your brain intact, you'll come back. There's total decapitation, starvation, although we do hear Lestat say that he went 100 years without blood at some point, so again, not exactly sure where the line goes on that. It may require you to be completely drained first before you can starve. The last thing we hear about how you can die as a vampire is drinking blood from those that are already dead, so you need blood from living animals or humans. How vampires get powers? In this universe, they get stronger and gain powers with age, and you can also increase your power by drinking the blood of a very old vampire. For example, if a brand new vampire is made by a very old vampire, and drinks their blood, they will automatically be more powerful than a vampire that was made by a younger vampire. So a lot of the powers we discuss are displayed by either very ancient vampires or those that were made by or know vampires who are very ancient. When you become a vampire, there's some basics you get. Enhanced senses, healing, durability, strength, speed, immortality, and the ability to make other vampires. Being hot. Wait. No, yeah, I stand by that one. But we also see things like stopping time, flight, the ability to control and start fire, reading other people's minds, speaking your thoughts into their minds, controlling humans' minds and bodies, some kind of fog with vampires so it can make them hard to move and speak. Yeah, there's a lot of options. Vampire laws? It's a little hard to tell if these 5 vampire laws are just one specific coven, or if they're actually some sort of universal vampire laws, but there's 5 that we hear about. The 5 being covens must have a leader, only they may change mortals into vampires, aka the Dark Gift. It's also semi-implied through this that you have to be in a coven to be a vampire. You're not supposed to be an individual roaming as a vampire. The Dark Gift is another word for becoming a vampire. Dark gifts cannot be given to crippled, maimed, or children. I think the idea here is that if you can't take care of yourself alone, you're not supposed to be created into a vampire, but I feel like we could have said that a bit better. But then again, these are given to us in 1940 and probably created another 200 or 500 years before that, so I guess we can kind of let it slide. No vampire shall commit history to writing. You're not supposed to write down the history or the existence of vampires and, I don't know, make a book out of it. No vampire shall reveal their nature to mortals and let them live. You know, like telling someone your entire life story and letting them make a book about it. Lastly, Coven Master has the power over life and death of those breaking these laws, so you're not supposed to kill vampires unless they're breaking these laws, and the Coven Master is supposed to be the one who does the killing. All of these are relevant, and all of these laws are heavily broken. Okay, y'all, this is the point of no return on spoilers. I'm going to be breaking down the betrayals, deaths, and twists throughout the story as we talk about the timeline. So let me make it through the timeline as quickly as possible. I made this timeline and used the Tumblr post in the description for a lot of the dates, so thanks to the person who posted that. When it comes to the timeline, there's really 3 distinct eras. There's pre-1910, there's 1910 through 1950s, which is the majority of the story that we hear, and then only a couple dates after 1950. Before 1910, there are only 4 major events that matter to the story, that being that Armand is turned in 1535, Lestat is turned in 1794, Armand and Lestat meet and revitalize Armand's coven. Lestat and Armand have a year-ish long relationship, where Lestat gets bored and leaves, but not before completely funding Armand's coven for the next 200 years. Lastly, Lestat sails to America in 1908 and meets Louis in 1910 New Orleans, which is where the story really begins. Lestat turns Louis in 1911, and 6 years later, he turns Claudia in 1917. Claudia leaves in 1923 and comes back in 1930, which is the same night that Louis and Lestat have the fight. Lestat is kicked out of the house for 7 years after the fight, and Louis takes him back in 1937. The Mardi Gras party and ultimately Lestat's fake death is in 1940, and Louis and Claudia look for old world vampires in Eastern Europe for 5 years before heading to Paris. They meet Armand and his coven in 1946, and not too long after, Claudia joins the coven officially. Claudia and her lover Madeleine die in 1949, after which Louis burns down the theater and kills nearly all of Armand's entire coven. The last era is after the 1950s, with the only important dates being the first interview, which takes place in 1973, and the second one, which is the framing of the entire story, which takes place in 2022, where Louis is telling us this lovely story. Character breakdowns. I'll be going through these characters in order of my favorite to least favorite. Take that how you want to. I am Daniel, he is me. Okay, yeah, Daniel is my favorite. Yes, I did pick the most human of all the characters, sure, but I also just think he's so funny. In a broad sense, each character in Interview with a Vampire represents a fundamental idea the story is circling. For Daniel, that idea is memory. Memory in perspective is where Daniel becomes essential. His fragile and shaking body isn't just a sign of age, it's a visual metaphor for memory itself. Unstable, incomplete, prone to distortion. He may appear to be the oldest person in the room, but between Daniel, Louis, and Armand, he's actually the youngest. The series goes out of its way to show us that immortality doesn't preserve the mind the same way it preserves the body. In many ways, they're even more emotionally immature than the mortal man sitting across from them. Exhibit A, the amount of times Armand makes this face. That's why Daniel matters. As the only human in the room, his questioning isn't just journalistic, it's confrontational. He functions as a physical reminder that memory fades, that stories change over time, and that perspective can't be trusted just because you lived longer. Louis, in particular, is an unreliable narrator, and the show never hides that fact. Sometimes his inconsistencies come from genuinely difficult remembering the past. Other times there's deliberate ways to soften the truth, reshape it, or avoid the confrontation altogether. Daniel is the one that keeps pushing back. He calls out the gaps. He notices when the story doesn't line up. So while Louis and Armand try to control the narrative through centuries of expertise, Daniel, shaky, mortal, fading Daniel, becomes the story's most honest lens. Not to mention the man is hilarious. He says it himself, he's an old man with all the triggers of one, and the wit flows like a river. He's incredibly smart. He can tell when Louis and Armand are attempting to hide things. He's detail-oriented and precise, and I doubt most of us caught that Louis claiming Lestat spoke into his head after he was being turned the first time we watched it. But the show went out of its way to purposely make a scene that was wrong, and we wouldn't notice the first time, just so the second time around we could say, how didn't I notice that? But not Daniel. Daniel noticed the first time. Not to mention he also has balls of steel. I mean, he is truly fearless. In 1973, not so much, but old Daniel accepts that this interview may as well be his last, and he does it anyways. He stares into the face of the most powerful being he's ever seen and nearly spits in his face. He slaps Louis after he fucks with his Parkinson's. His no fucks given attitude makes it 10 times funnier when he calls out Louis for being ridiculous. It's a Univision night. He's constantly pointing out the most ridiculous points in the story. He asks about Louis trying to eat his nephew, Lestat's picture on the wall, and Armand's past relationships with Lestat. I mean, he's just asking what we're all thinking, honestly. He's also a physical reminder of the years Louis has spent without Claudia. Daniel was only born a few years after Claudia died. Seeing him this old is another reminder to Louis of all the years he's lost with Claudia and the aging she never got to experience. Daniel represents a lot in the show. Memory, humor, perspective, humanity, but more than anything, Daniel Malloy is the glue that holds the story together. He's how we're experiencing the story, and is the reason for the framing that we see. He binds the past to the present, and is who the viewer experiences the story through. We're supposed to relate to him. We're not rich, morally corrupt vampires like everyone else that we meet. We are human. We are skeptical. We are experiencing Louis' unreliable memory and skewed perspective the exact same way Daniel is. I'm glad he takes no shit. I'm glad he's smart enough and fearless enough to find the real truth in a sea of lies that he's been cast into. Daniel is the perfect frame for an amazing story. Daniel represents memory, Claudia represents grief. I may hate on Claudia at times, but that's because I hate on everyone. It's part of my charm. But one thing I want to make incredibly clear about Claudia is that she is the biggest victim of the story. When it comes to Claudia, grief is more of a state of being, ongoing, unresolved, and impossible to outgrow. Claudia's tragedy isn't that she's turned into a vampire as a child. It's that she's never given the space, time, or agency to process any of the losses that follow. Her life is defined by an accumulation of grief stacked on top with no room to breathe in between. Claudia doesn't meaningfully grieve her family before she's pulled into a mythological world that she never asked to enter. One moment she's a human child with a family, a home, and a future, and the next she's immortal. There is no mourning period, no transition, and no choice. She's dropped into vampirism, fully formed and expected to adapt instantly as if survival alone is enough. It isn't. The lack of choice becomes fundamental to her character. Claudia is trapped between child and adult, denied the ability to grow while also being forced to understand far more than she should. Her body never changes and her mind does. And that mismatch creates a constant, grinding grief. She grieves the woman she'll never become. She grieves an adulthood she can only imagine but never truly reach. Even her desire itself becomes painful because it has nowhere to go. When Claudia experiences love for the first time, she loses it, not to fate but to her own mistakes. That loss carries a specific cruelty. It's not just that her first relationship ends in tragedy, it's that she's never allowed to properly mourn it. Louis and Lestat, the two father figures who should act like emotional anchors, fail her completely. One is avoidant and guilt-ridden, and the other is controlling and dismissive. Claudia is left alone with her grief, and when she tries to act on it, she's punished for being too emotional, too angry, too much. Running away feels like her only choice, and even away from home, Claudia's grief compounds. She experiences violence and sexual assault while isolated, adding another layer of trauma that is never truly processed. This matters not because of the shock, but because it reinforces the same pattern. Claudia's pain is always treated as something to endure rather than something to be acknowledged. There is never space for her to stop and grieve what's been taken from her. And Claudia doesn't just represent her own grief, she becomes a living embodiment for the grief of Louis and Lestat as well. Louis' grief calcifies around her. Lestat's love curdles into control. Their failures as fathers don't end with her suffering, they haunt them long after. Claudia becomes the loss they orbit, the wound they can't heal, the proof of everything they did wrong. In that way, Claudia is grief from every angle all at once. The grief of a stolen childhood, the grief of a stolen future, and the grief of desire without fulfillment. She's not simply a victim of forced vampirism, she's a reminder that immortality does not pause trauma, it freezes it. And Claudia is forced to live inside that freezing forever. Claudia's story is tragic in just about every way, but she's also the character with the most life. She is a bright spot in many times of Louis' life. She is sharp, observant, and emotionally intelligent in a way that surpasses the adults around her. Claudia notices things early about Louis' self-denial and Lestat's manipulations, about the unspoken rules of vampiric life, and she refuses to pretend she doesn't. Where Louis intellectualizes his suffering and Lestat dramatizes it, what makes her especially compelling is that her anger is justified. Claudia isn't petulant or cruel for the sake of it. She's reacting logically to an impossible situation. She was turned without consent, raised by two deeply flawed fathers, and expected to be grateful for eternity. Even when she's hurt or cornered, she retains an astonishing sense of self. She doesn't disappear into victimhood. She resists it. And crucially, Claudia wants more. More knowledge, freedom, truth. That hunger makes her dangerous, not because she's violent, but because she refuses to be stagnant. Claudia is not treated as a plot device or a moral lesson. Her thoughts matter, her perspective matters, and her pain is not just something that happens to motivate others, it stands on its own. When she speaks, the story listens. In a series full of monsters who romanticize themselves, Claudia is the one who most clearly understands the cost, and instead of becoming numb to it, she stays awake. Angry, alive, and it makes her unforgettable. I wish she could have found happiness for longer, but I'm glad she found it at least a little bit toward the end. Lestat. Yes, I just finished explaining how bad Lestat fails Claudia as a father. And yes, I still love him anyways, because Lestat is power fully realized, seductive, theatrical, destructive, and intoxicating to watch. He doesn't just have power, he performs it. Lestat treats life like a stage and himself like the main event, and he needs everyone else to play their assigned roles around him. On a practical level, Lestat is the most powerful vampire we see early on, and possibly at all. We'll hopefully see more of that in the next season. Physically, he is overwhelming. Socially, he understands how to dominate a room before anyone else even seems to realize there's a game being played. Emotionally, he is manipulative in ways that are both precise and devastating. He cheats, kills, lies, withholds, and provokes not out of boredom, but out of control. Control is how he survives. His obsession with music and performance isn't accidental, it's central. Music is where Lestat's power becomes visible. It's where his eyes light up, where his cruelty turns into artistry. His violence becomes spectacle. When Lestat performs, he isn't just expressing himself, he's demanding recognition. Applause is proof that he exists, that he matters, that he isn't alone. And loneliness is a key to understanding him. For all his dominance, Lestat is ruled by one thing he can't command: love. Specifically, Louis' love. Lestat craves validation from Louis in a way that makes all of his other powers seem fragile. He wants devotion, admiration, desire, reassurance, and when Louis withholds those things from him, it wounds him more deeply than a physical threat ever could. Louis' restraint, his guilt, his emotional distance becomes weaponized against Lestat, whether Louis intends that or not. Lestat can stop time, read minds, and kill without consequence, but he cannot make Louis love him the way he needs to be loved. And that inability drives most of the destructive choices he makes throughout the show. Hey, at least he didn't overreact. This is what makes Lestat compelling rather than cartoonish. His power is real, and so is his insecurities. He loves destructively, but not because he enjoys cruelty, but because he is terrified of abandonment. He would rather be hated than ignored. He would rather be feared than left. He self-sabotages anything good as a means of trying to control his life. Even his worst behavior, his manipulation of Claudia, his emotional games with Louis, his constant need to provoke is rooted in the same fear, that without attention, without love, without an audience, he will disappear. Lestat shows us that power does not eliminate vulnerability. It concentrates it. The more power he has, the more catastrophic it becomes when it fails him. And nowhere does it fail him more completely than in love. That's why Lestat isn't just a villain or a seducer or a monster. He's a tragedy with pizzazz. People still say pizzazz? Let me be clear before I go any further. Lestat is not a good person. He is often the primary antagonist in Louis' story. He is manipulative, controlling, abusive, and incapable of incredible cruelty. None of that is accidental, none of that is minimized by the show, and none of it is something I'm interested in apologizing for. I'm not a Lestat apologist. But Interview with the Vampire is not a story about good people and bad people. It's a story about monsters. God, this show can be so corny. And monsters complicate morality by default. At a base level, every vampire in the series is born into violence. Their survival requires the exploitation and the death of humans, for the most part. There's no ethical version of that. No amount of self-control or moral qualms changes the fact that their existence is predatory. So when we talk about good and evil in the show, we're already operating on shades of gray. I don't know if it's 50 exactly, but evil is the baseline. What varies is how each character lives with it. Lestat leans into it, Louis resists it, Claudia rages against it, and Armand intellectualizes it. That's the point. Lestat is often mostly bad, but mostly is not the same thing as entirely. And the show understands this distinction intimately. It allows characters to be harmful without flattening them into just villains. It allows them to be abusive without turning them into caricatures. It lets them be monstrous and wounded at the same time. These characters are far from one-dimensional. And yes, I can like a character while fully acknowledging that they are a bad person. This is not a new or radical idea. Fiction has always allowed us to explore people we would never excuse in real life. What matters is whether the story understands the harm being done. Interview with the Vampire does. I don't empathize with Lestat because I excuse his behavior, I empathize with him because I understand it. I understand the fear of abandonment that drives him. I understand the desperation for love and validation. I understand how power becomes armor when vulnerability feels unsafe. There's a difference between a bad character and a character who is bad. Interview with the Vampire lives in this difference. It's not interested in redemption arcs or moral purity. It's interested in what happens when people, especially queer people, are taught that survival requires brutality, secrecy, and self-erasure. Sometimes evil isn't about corruption. Sometimes it's about self-defense or expression. Sometimes it's about loving someone so badly you don't know how to do it without causing damage. It's gay, it's toxic, it's horrifying. For all the damage Lestat causes, for the manipulation and cruelty and the terrible parenting, there is one thing the show makes painfully clear. Lestat loves deeply. He loves loudly, clumsily, and without any real tools on how to do it well. Lestat's love for Louis is not subtle. It's obsessive, romantic, desperate, and sincere. He chooses Louis not because Louis is easy to control, but because Louis sees him, and he sees Louis right back. Louis challenges him, resists him, and that resistance makes it feel like the love he will get in return from Louis is earned, in a way that Lestat has never experienced before. When Lestat says he loves Louis, he means it in the most complete way he knows how, even if the way he shows it is often selfish and destructive. The man is down horrendously bad for Louis. Lestat does not know how to love gently. He knows how to protect, to provide, to impress, to perform. He offers Louis immortality not as a trap, but as a gift, even if it takes Louis 100 years to realize that. He offers him a shared eternity, a promise he will never be alone again, and while the promise is deeply flawed, it is still rooted in devotion, not malice. The same is true for Claudia. Lestat loves Claudia in the only way he understands how, by keeping her close and keeping her controlled. It doesn't make it right, it makes it tragic. Lestat sees Claudia as something precious and dangerous, something that could be taken from him, someone else that could leave him behind, and she does. His strictness and cruelty come from fear of loss, fear of being replaced, fear of being unnecessary. He wants to be needed, by Louis, by Claudia, by frankly, anyone. He is constantly trying to prove he is worth staying for. I'm sure that's not because of any emotional trauma from his past. What makes Lestat compelling, and honestly lovable, is that he keeps trying anyways. He fails constantly, spectacularly. He hurts the people he loves, he makes selfish choices, and he never stops reaching for connection. He never stops wanting to be enough, even when he doesn't know how. Lestat is not a good man, he's not a good father, he's not a healthy partner, but he is a deeply human monster. And in a story full of immortal beings pretending they're above human emotion, Lestat is the one who feels everything too much. Louis de Pointe du Lac. What a fun name. He embodies shame so completely that it becomes the organizing principle of his life, both before and after vampirism. His shame does not originate with becoming a monster, it predates it. As a black man in 1910 New Orleans, Louis exists in a world that constantly reminds him of his limits. He can acquire wealth, influence, and status, but never legitimacy. He is tolerated, not respected. Every interaction reinforces the idea that his power is conditional and revocable. Layer onto that Louis' queerness and something he's never allowed to express openly or safely. His desire becomes something to be hidden, managed, and punished. His religious upbringing compounds this even further. Catholic guilt, racial marginalization, and internalized homophobia form a perfect storm, a belief system where wanting anything at all feels like a moral failure. By the time Lestat enters his life, Louis is already living in a state of constant self-repression. Vampirism does not free Louis from the shame like Lestat had hoped, but rather it created another thing for him to feel shame about. As a vampire, Louis becomes reluctant, restrained, and self-denying. He refuses to kill humans when he can, choosing animals, or carefully selecting prey not purely out of compassion, but out of penance. His feeding habits are moral performances as much as ethics. Killing becomes a sin to avoid rather than a reality to be reckoned with. Louis equates suffering with goodness and restraint with righteousness, even as his restraint poisons his relationship. This is especially visible in his relationship with Lestat. Louis withholds love, affirmation, and vulnerability not because he doesn't feel them, but because he believes expressing them would make him weak, indulgent, or damned. He critiques Lestat's extravagance and cruelty while quietly benefiting from the life Lestat provides. He positions himself as morally superior while refusing to fully own the choices he makes. This contradiction, judging others while punishing himself, is the core of his shame. Louis' shame also shapes how he tells his own story. He is an unreliable narrator not because he is malicious, but because guilt and repression distort his memory. He edits events to minimize his agency and maximize his suffering. Sometimes it comes from genuinely difficult remembering, other times it's an unconscious attempt to protect himself from the truths that would force him to acknowledge his own desire, complicity, or cruelty. Shame keeps him from fully embracing himself, but it also keeps him from fully choosing goodness. Immortality gives him infinite time to sit inside that indecision, replaying the same regrets with the new justification. Louis doesn't just feel shame, he builds his identity around it, convincing himself that suffering is proof of virtue. He spends so much of his existence trying to make everyone comfortable, avoiding trying to choose sides, trying to soften the impact of every decision until it barely resembles a decision at all. And in doing so, he often makes things worse. His hesitation becomes its own kind of cruelty. His silence becomes a choice, whether he intends for it to be or not. Lestat feels starved for affection and affirmation. Claudia feels trapped between two fathers who refuse to communicate. Even Daniel feels the weight of Louis' selective honesty. His hypocrisy compounds the damage. Louis condemns Lestat's indulgence while benefiting from it. He critiques excess while living in luxury. He despises violence while participating in it when it suits him. In trying to make everyone happy, Louis ultimately makes no one happy, least of all himself. His indecision stretches moments of pain into decades of suffering. Instead of choosing and accepting the consequences, he delays, represses, internalizes, turning conflict inward until it rots. Louis' life is harder not because he is cruel, but because he is afraid to make the wrong choice. And in a world where immortality offers endless time to avoid your choices, Louis proves that hesitation can be just as destructive as violence. But for all of his flaws and contradictions and hesitations, Louis de Pointe-du-Lac is still, at his core, a deeply moral character, and that matters in a story full of monsters who often choose not to be. Louis is good because he tries. That may sound small, but in a world where violence is effortless and consequence-free, effort becomes meaningful. Louis resists killing humans because it hurts him to do so. He feels every death and he carries it with him. Even when his methods are imperfect or hypocritical, the fact that he cares at all sets him apart from many of the vampires we're around. He is good in the way he loves, even when he loves badly. Louis' love for Lestat is complicated, restrained, and often withheld, but it's still there. His inability to express it comes from fear and shame, not indifference. He is terrified of what wanting openly has cost him before: safety, family, self-worth. Loving Lestat means confronting all of that at once. That doesn't excuse the damage his restraint causes, but it explains it. Armand is guilt made flesh. Where other characters explode outward through violence, indulgence, or obsession, Armand collapses inward. His defining trait is not power, passion, or even love, but atonement. Every choice he makes is shaped by the belief that he has already committed an unforgivable wrong, and that the rest of his existence must be spent paying for it. Armand's guilt begins with survival. He lives through the events that destroy others, Claudia, the Coven, and survival becomes its own kind of crime. He caused Claudia's death, he betrays his coven, and he aligns himself with Louis while simultaneously enabling the system that harmed him. Each decision is justified in the moment. Rather than confront this guilt, Armand manages it. He becomes a mediator, a fixer, a silent administrator in other people's chaos. He cleans up Louis' messes. He shields him from consequences. On the surface, this reads as devotion, Underneath it, it's self-punishment. Armand does not believe he deserves happiness. His relationship with Louis is not sustained by joy or passion, but by obligation. He knows they're unhappy. He knows it 50 years ago. He knows the love has calcified into routine and restraint, and yet he stays. Leaving would mean choosing himself, and choosing himself would mean admitting that Claudia's death, the coven's destruction, and the decades of suffering did not earn him the lifelong penance. In Armand's mind, staying is payment. You can clearly see in the 1973 flashbacks that they are already a broken couple beyond repair, but Armand continues to constantly trying to fix their lives. He justifies his acts as protection for Louis and himself, but altering Louis's memories is not mercy, it's control disguised as care, and Armand lives with the knowledge that he has violated not just minds, but truth itself. Memory becomes another thing Armand manipulates because he cannot bear the weight of it untouched. He convinced himself that what he does is necessary, that it prevents greater harm, that it keeps the peace. But he's not absolving his guilt, he's compounding it. Armand does not assert himself because asserting himself would mean choosing. Him and Louis are two peas in a pod with their lack of decision-making skills. He believes that as long as he is unhappy, as long as he is sacrificing himself, he is being good. But guilt is not the same as accountability, and enduring is not the same as love. He lies, manipulates, and withholds the truth. He allows Louis to walk all over him, bending to his desires and tolerating his hypocrisies even when it hurts him. On paper, these actions can be read as weakness or even as cruelty. He keeps secrets, edits memories, and fails to intervene fully when chaos erupts around him. Betrayal in Armand's case is often a form of preservation. He is morally gray to the extreme, a character who is bad and yet perfectly understandable. This is what makes him fascinating. He's like Lestat in many ways. Ancient, powerful, magnetic, but where Lestat flares outward, Armand contains himself. He is disciplined, patient, and eternally aware of the weight of his choices. His power is subtle, hidden behind loyalty and silence, yet it is no less formidable. When I first watched the show, Armand went straight to my shit list, but after rewatching a few times and sitting with it, I get it. I get him. His guilt, his self-preservation, and his compounding lies all make perfect sense if he's desperate to hold on to the man he thinks he loves. My hardest part I have with wrestling with Armand as a character is how he could allow Claudia and Madeline, and even Louis, to die for his coven. It's one of the few things I never fully understood, because if he loves him, loves Louis enough to stay through his cheating and his lack of love and their overall mess of a relationship, why was he willing to let him die? Or is his greatest fear loneliness, just like Lestat? Are they just two sides of the same coin? He cannot escape his guilt, but he channels it into something functional: preservation, repair, mitigation. Armand's moral complexity makes him endlessly interesting. I want to make it clear that just because he's last on this list of characters does not mean I don't love him. I am excited to see where his character goes this season, but I just can't really get over the fact that he was willing to let Claudia and Louis die, especially considering he stayed with Louis for 70 years afterward. He's Louis' turbo rebound, and Louis is his mega second choice. My favorite part, scene discussion. I want to go through some scenes I thought were especially good, impactful, or really highlighted a relationship dynamic between characters. The first being the opera house scene between Louis and Lestat. The opera scene is a window into the interview with a vampire core dynamics: power, love, race, performance, and emotional dismissal all colliding in a single night. On the surface, it's romantic and indulgent. Velvet seats, music swelling, Lestat glowing in his element, but emotionally, it's one of the loneliest moments Louis experiences early in his vampiric life. Lestat adores music. To him, the opera is transcendent, proof that life has meaning and beauty beyond survival. But that obsession becomes a weapon in this moment. Louis arrives emotionally shattered, trying to articulate the horror of almost killing his own nephew, a line he nearly crosses that night. Lestat doesn't meet him there. He doesn't slow down or listen. Instead, he barrels forward into a spectacle, treating Louis' confession as an inconvenience rather than a crisis. The message is clear. Get over it. The art, the performance, the night is more important, not Louis' guilt or fear. That dismissal is made even more brutal by the visible power imbalance between them. Louis is not just Lestat's fledgling, he is a black man in a segregated world forced to enter the opera house as a fake ballet, literally performing servitude in order to access a space he's unwelcome in. Lestat, as both his maker and a white man, glides through without consequence. He doesn't just possess supernatural power, he benefits from social power that Louis can never escape. The scene makes it painfully obvious that vampirism does not erase systematic inequality, it simply adds another layer of control. and yet buried inside this imbalance is one of Lestat's most quietly honest moments. When he tells Louis that his greatest fear as a vampire is loneliness, Louis recounts the story decades later to Daniel. He frames it as manipulative. I mean, I get why he would. As another performance meant to deflect accountability and pull Louis back into orbit, but there's a strong argument that this is one of the rare moments where Lestat is not performing at all. For all his theatrics, fear of loneliness is the truest thing about him. It's the driving force of his personality, the excess, the control, the desperation for attention, the refusal to let Louis pull away. Lestat doesn't know how to love without possession, but that doesn't make the fear itself fake. This love and possession is also clear during the trial, when Lestat literally says, "crushing what you cannot have," as if love and Louis is a thing to own. What makes this scene even more devastating is, in hindsight, how it mirrors the present-day framing of the story. Just as Louis once pretended to be Lestat's servant in public to survive and maintain proximity, Armand now pretends to be Louis' servant, minimizing himself, hiding his power, reshaping the truth to keep Louis safe and close. The roles have shifted, but the pattern remains. One big fucked up cycle, let me tell ya. The opera scene isn't just a night out or a fight left unresolved. It's a blueprint for the entire series, how performance replaces communication and how characters convince themselves that endurance is the same thing as devotion. The first interview fight. What makes this fight so uncomfortable is that Daniel is literally dying in the corner of the room and neither of them seem to care. He's slumped there, barely conscious, and Armand and Louis are too busy tearing each other apart to even look at him. And the first thing Louis does is devastating in the quiet possible way. He doesn't accuse Armand of being cruel, he calls him boring. He tells him that being with him feels like being suffocated by a beige pillow, and it's such a small, unpoetic insult. But that's exactly why it cuts so deep. Louis isn't saying Armand is evil, he's saying he's irrelevant, that he's not exciting enough for him, and it's unspoken, but there's also just the idea that he's not as exciting as Lestat. And Louis knows exactly what he's doing when he calls Daniel interesting in that same breath. Because Armand's power doesn't come from violence, it comes from being needed, from being the person someone chooses. And Louis just steps around him emotionally like he's furniture. Then Louis brings up Armand cutting his hands off, and if you know the history, this line is horrifying. He's talking about Nikki, Lestat's first love. You know, the one Armand stole away from him there too? Armand mutilated him by cutting off his hands, and Nikki later killed himself. What makes it more unbearable is that this reference to Nikki's death is made minutes before Louis tries to kill himself too. The show does not stop to explain the connection, it just lets it sit there. The fight, with full context of the rest of the show and the background, is honestly horrifying. There is a reference after reference of the relationship between all four of the vampires and references of their past traumas and unresolved issues. Louis is weaponizing Armand's past without realizing he's pointing directly to his own future. Both of them are standing in the wreckage of what loving Lestat does to people. That's when Armand finally hits back. He calls Louis out for something no one else is allowed to say out loud. Louis is not over Lestat. He never has been, and it doesn't matter how much Louis denies it or how carefully he avoids saying Lestat's name around Armand, because the second he's away from him, Louis jumps at the chance. Armand points out that Louis is always the victim in his own story. Not wrong. That things just happen to him, that he never quite admits he makes choices, and that accusation lands because it's true. Then Armand says one of the most diabolical lines in the entire show, "My daughter was my sister, was my throw pillow." He's saying Claudia was never allowed to be a person. She was a role Louis needed her to fill: daughter, sister, emotional support, justification. And when Armand says Louis threw Claudia's name around as cover to avoid talking about Lestat, it frames her entire life. Claudia wasn't just destroyed by Lestat. She was shaped for Louis and about Lestat. She was stuck between them from the moment she was turned. And when Armand says Claudia didn't love Louis the way Lestat did, it's not just meant to hurt, it exposes the imbalance at the center of their little family. Because that's what they are, a family. Just the worst possible version of one. Lestat loves Louis, Louis loves Claudia, and Claudia can't stand either of them. It's one big fucked up cycle of devotion and resentment where love is always uneven and someone is always paying the price for it. This fight, 23 years after the trial, is about Lestat. It's always been about Lestat.
Lestat, 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 Lestat.
The night Claudia is turned is one of the most morally complex moments in Interview with a Vampire, especially once we're given Lestat's version of events. It strips away the myth Louis has been telling himself for decades and replaces it with something far more uncomfortable. Responsibility shared, damage co-authored, and a love weaponized by desperation. In the flashbacks, it's painfully clear that Lestat knows this is wrong, not just philosophically, but personally. He understands what creating Claudia will mean for her, for Louis, and for himself. He knows what her life will be like, denied a future, denied autonomy, denied the ability to grow into herself. He also knows that this specific choice will haunt both of them. And yet, he does it anyways. Because in that moment, Lestat is terrified of losing Louis. Louis is already slipping away, emotionally distanced and repulsed by what Lestat made him. And when Louis gets on his knees and begs, it isn't framed as manipulation as much as raw, desperate pleading. He asks Lestat to give him a daughter, to give him a reason to stay. There's also an unspoken guilt hanging over Lestat here too. Louis just told him this same day that Lestat took his life. His future, his humanity, his choices. It's not hard to imagine Lestat replaying that line over and over again in his head. If he took away Louis' chance at a normal life, at fatherhood, at legacy, then how else is he supposed to give it back? In a twisted way, Claudia becomes an attempt at restitution, a monstrous solution to an impossible problem. And that's the tragedy of it. Lestat doesn't turn Claudia because he believes it's right, he turns her because he believes it will make Louis stay. He sacrifices Claudia's entire existence to preserve the one thing he fears losing most, Louis and Lestat's balcony scene. The Mardi Gras balcony scene is, to me, one of the most devastating moments of the entire show. By this point, Lestat knows. Not just suspects, he knows. He knows Louis and Claudia are planning to kill him that night. He even thinks he knows how they're going to do it. And yet, he stays. Not only does he stay, he doesn't barricade himself inside or lash out preemptively. He stands on the balcony of their home, overlooking the chaos and celebrating Mardi Gras. He asks Louis for one final dance. I don't think Lestat believes he's going to die in this moment. He's too powerful, too confident for his own good. But I do think he knows that this is the end for him and Louis, one way or another. Even if he survives physically, whatever they have is going to be gone. And that realization is written all over Sam Reed's face. As they stand together, Lestat talks about New Orleans, about how the city was built through disaster, struggle, and survival. On the surface, it sounds like nostalgia, but it doesn't take much digging to realize he's talking about them, or maybe about himself. About a relationship forged in chaos, sustained through pain, and somehow still containing beauty. He knows it was toxic and destructive, and yet he loved it. He loved them, and he's mourning it in real time. Sam Reed's performance here is absolutely heartbreaking. Lestat looked like he's on the edge of tears, barely holding himself together. When he laughs it off towards the end, it feels less like charm and more like self-preservation. He tries to play it as nothing because actually saying what it means, that he's afraid, that he loves Louis, that he knows he's losing him, would break him. Louis can barely look at him. That's what makes it hurt even more. When Lestat asks for the final dance, Louis knows what it might mean. He knows this could be the last moment they share without hatred, manipulation, or violence hanging between them. And the guilt of that knowledge sits heavy in silence. The dance itself is stunning. When the scene cuts to them dancing alone with the party guests gone, it feels like the world has narrowed down to just the two of them. For a brief moment, nothing else exists. Not Claudia, not the plan, not the inevitable betrayal waiting around the corner. It's just them, moving together like they used to. There's something deeply tragic about the idea that this might be the last time either of them truly feels loved. The reveal. I actually got the entire big reveal ruined for me by TikTok. This scene here, which is arguably the best scene in the entire show, but I'm glad they ruined it for me because it's the reason I watched the whole thing. So, thanks for the spoiler, TikTok. The trial. I will not be discussing the trial in detail in this video. It's my favorite episode of the entire series, and I often go back to rewatch it over and over again. I love the different perspective. I think I could dissect the entire episode for hours, and maybe I will in the future if that's something people are interested in. But overall, I only have a few words to say. I love Claudia, I love Madeline, Lestat actually ate us up in that suit, and fuck your boyfriend. One of the most remarkable aspects of Interview with the Vampire is the way it situates race and identity at the center of its story, shaping not only the events, but the very psychology of its characters. Louis de Pointe-du-Lac is a black gay man living in 1910s New Orleans, and that fact is never incidental. It's not a background detail or a flavor of the setting, it's a constant force acting upon him, influencing his every decision, every interaction, every moment of fear or pride. From the start, Louis exists in a world that tolerates him only conditionally. The society around him rarely grants him respect, and every display of power or autonomy is reactionary. Louis' race intertwines with every aspect of his identity. He's gay, he's raised religious, morality is constantly conflicting with who he is. These pressures compound into a profound sense of internalized shame and self-policing. He restrains his desires, hides his love, and constantly measures himself against the impossible standards, both human and supernatural. His struggle with identity is inseparable from his experience as a black man navigating a society built to limit him. Even as a vampire, immortal and physically dominant, these human constraints persist. He cannot fully escape the cultural and personal forces that shape him, but it's not just Louis whose identity is shaped by society. Lestat, while a white European, is intensely performative and obsessed with status, attention, and admiration. His identity is defined by power and by the way he can bend perception and control others, and even his choices are driven by societal pressures and expectations. He craves validation from Louis, needing love and acknowledgement to define his own sense of self-worth. Lestat's flamboyance, cruelty, and genius are inseparable from the need to assert his identity in a world that cannot offer him authenticity. Claudia's identity is forcibly fractured. She's trapped between child and adult, between innocence and power, between the family she lost and the immortality thrust upon her. She's denied the basic human experience of growing up, of grieving properly, of experiencing her sexuality safely. Her grief is compounded by trauma, the loss of her first boyfriend, parental figures, and sexual assault. Claudia embodies the consequences of having identity imposed upon her rather than chosen. She is both a victim and a survivor, a young woman navigating an unknown world that offers her no permission for autonomy. Even Armand, the oldest and most disciplined of the vampires, is shaped by identity. Not just the imposed identity of race, but also poverty that he was born into years ago. Across the board, Interview with the Vampire demonstrates that identity is never static. It's always negotiated, performed, always constrained by social forces, history, and personal trauma. Race, class, sexuality, morality, and age intersect to define how each character experiences the world and each other. They are physically immortal, but psychologically they remain profoundly human, capable of insecurity, fear, love, shame, longing, and growth. This show highlights how identity can be a source of power and vulnerability at the same time. It's what makes Louis' moral restraint meaningful, Lestat's need to love devastatingly relatable, Claudia's struggle heartbreaking, and Armand's loyalty tragic. In the end, race and identity are not just themes of the story. They are the lens through which each choice, every relationship, and every conflict is filtered through. They shape who the characters are, who they become, and how the audience can connect with them. In a world where monsters can live forever, it's the human truths, the shame, the guilt, the grief, and the yearning for recognition that define immortality more than the strength or speed ever could. If race and identity shape how these characters move through the world, then the 5 central themes of memory, power, shame, grief, and guilt define how they move through themselves. Interview with the Vampire is a story about immortal beings, but it's just as much, if not more, about the humanity that they cannot escape. Memory makes Daniel fragile but wise, reminding us that the oldest and strongest are subject to the erosion of time. Power makes Lestat dazzling and terrifying, yet it's tempered by love and the desperate need for validation. Shame keeps Louis tethered to his own conscious and social pressures, forcing him into moral dilemmas that are as relatable as they are tragic. Grief defines Claudia's impossible existence, showing us what it means to lose everything before one can even fully exist. And guilt binds Armand to the world of others, creating a web of loyalty, atonement, and quiet suffering that is both heartbreaking and understandable. What makes the show so compelling is how these themes intersect with each other and with the character's identity. No one exists in isolation. Every choice reverberates through the relationships, through time, and through memory itself. A lie here, a hesitation there, a withheld word of love, it all has consequences, and the show never shies away from showing them. Yet it also asks us to sit with morally gray characters, to understand rather than forgive, to empathize rather than excusing. The vampires are monsters, yes, but they're also deeply human. They love, they fail, they hurt, and are hurt in return. That complexity is rare, and it's what makes this story feel so fresh and timeless. The show is about finding love and connection in the most impossible circumstances, and about confronting the dark parts of ourselves that we'd rather ignore. This is why I love it. It challenges expectations of what vampire stories can be. It refuses to simplify its characters, its emotion, or the world. It's unafraid to ask the audience to wrestle with the same shame, grief, guilt, and desire that haunts its moral protagonists. I love the twists and turns it takes us through. I love the acting, and more than anything, I love these characters. Interview with the Vampire isn't just the best vampire show on TV, it's one of the most emotionally honest shows I've ever seen. Interview with the Vampire, you have my undivided attention. I'm your average viewer. Thanks for watching.